Okay, the dialogue tree. Well, the evolution of the dialogue tree is relatively simple, but somewhat convoluted at the same time. When the first text parser adventure games were coming out, most of the logic was handwritten, conditional if and case statements, if you will, which were written specifically for a scene or an encounter. Very, very quickly, however, people realized that these were rather similar in nature, and they started coming up with formalized systems. Though in the early days of text adventures, some rather interesting cases would happen where people would use the variety of inputs, and the logic wasn't plain simple. However, with the need to streamline this and to make it more efficient, what happened is several systems evolved. So, as I say, text parser was the original situation we were in, because it just made the most sense, in that you would say, like, ask about Fred, or pick up knife, and you would have all these verbs and adjectives and systems. However, it still allowed for some special case programming, and some interesting situations happened where games were actually played in the dialogue tree, and things happened in dialogue, conversations, social interactions. So there was some interesting stuff going on there. However, as I say, we're always looking to optimize and genericize systems, being programmers. So very, very soon, systems started developing for genericizing trees, so that the writers didn't have to code the same logic over and over and over. And eventually, systems like Sierra's middleware called AGI, which was later replaced with SGI, things like LucasArts SCUM system, they started to develop generic content systems for building scene-by-scene dialogue trees. The unified middleware solution they provided was easy to test. It had a robust framework. There was very little chance that pure dialogue would totally break the system, so to speak. It was safer, and it sped up the process. And then what happened is these systems tried to improve themselves constantly for the player experience, and you got into a situation where the text parser was thrown away because people would get stuck in a game because they didn't know specifically what word to use, or they get frustrated and la la la. And so basically the point and click adventure became all about the mouse, and the moment that happened, the text parser started falling to the wayside, and you started getting, say, series choices. Now, the way to explain this is, with the text parser system, you'd have a list of topics you could ask about that would map, and some topics had to be like 3 deep, like you would ask about Fred, but then you would ask about where was Fred last night. You couldn't straight away ask where was Fred last night, you had to process through. But it was almost like it was a very wide tree, you could say, but it was still, it had parts of progression. But the moment we formalized it into, say, 5 dialogue choices, 3 dialogue choices every time, then it was very, very quickly to immediately realize it into a tree-like structure. Now, again, as I've said before, tree is actually a misnomer, because the data structure, or the structure of these dialogue systems, ends up more being a graph, because you can loop back. The mathematical definition of a tree is that there is only one path to every single node. Well, in a lot of dialogue systems, modern dialogue systems, there's actually multiple paths, and there's loop back situations and such. So you've got the graph there. Now, as I say, these systems help make games cheaper, and they help make game writers more empowered, and it was a big innovation. It really pushed things forward. But now the problem is they started losing some of their beauty, shall we say, their advancement. So what they started doing is they started introducing scripting into these dialogue systems. And these very simple dialogue systems became scripts. So it was like, well, you can't ask about the dragon until you've seen the dragon, or you cannot talk about nighttime if it's not nighttime. And if you have killed so-and-so, then I like you and I'll talk to you more. And very simple things about whether a person liked you or not would change which node of the tree they visited, or possibly would take part of a sentence and change it. So an example would be, in some games you'd have multiple character choices, like in Hero's Quest, for instance, which was Quest for Glory. You had 3 different classes, and sometimes the dialogue would change based on whatever class you'd chosen. But what would actually happen is just a little piece of dialogue got replaced. Now, what I'd like you to do visually to conceive that is actually think about those that dialogue being broken up into layers in a graph, and then having a branching center that recoupled back down. So as I say, the graph system became the de facto standard, and then from there on we improved the outputs mostly, moving from just simple text output to fully voice acted lines with lip sync and animation, and the cost of each line of dialogue or each item in the social interaction skyrocketed to the point where it's extremely expensive now. And those kind of branches were pruned because of the costs of content. Now, some games had some intelligent solutions like Mass Effect, which always referred to the character as Shepard and never the first name. But ultimately, you've got this dialogue tree. So why has this never really been altered? Simply put, it's a system that works, and it's a system that's very hard to find an alternative to. In terms of why did we lose the text parser, for instance, the text parser is much more flexible, much more interesting, and we put more research into the text parser, as much research as we've put into other fields, like say graphics. We would be leaps and bounds ahead. But the problem was the return for a project. It was no one, when they're making a game, thinks about what the game industry needs or what the development of the field needs, so to speak. They're thinking about the product, rightly so. So when they look at inputs, players preferred multiple selections. It's easier, it's more predictable, you can control the story more. There's a lot of design reasons for it, and there's a lot of programmatic reasons for it, because it's controlling the amount of content. And when you get to a situation like consoles, then there's not even the option for the keyboard. So there's all these very good reasons for a dialogue tree to exist. So let's see, other things I want to talk about the dialogue tree. Oh yes, the dialogue tree is non-interactive. There's a very famous games designer who's been working on a lot of interesting stuff called Chris Crawford, where he basically he rallied against the concept of games as it stands. I'm not going to try to paraphrase him because he's a very controversial figure, and I would put my foot in my mouth. But needless to say, he argued that they're not interactive at all, because all you're doing is traversing this graph. You're not actually altering it in any significant way. I mean, you may change a few paths of the graph, or may traverse it in your own fashion or your own order, but ultimately you are going to traverse it, not alter it or create it. And so several systems came up where people try to introduce systems into dialogue trees. Mostly from the pen and paper roots. So things like Elder Scrolls implemented dialogue options, which would be prefixed with skills that you would use, like lie, intimidate, sense motive, flirt, and this will all go through. And I mean, Planescape Torment most probably had the most complex dialogue tree or dialogue graph. I'm going to keep on calling it a dialogue tree, even though it is a graph, ever conceived. Entire quests were carried out in it, entire social interactions. But Crawford's point remains true. These social interactions are completely linear, or you traverse, and even while occasionally you would have what we'd call a destructive choice, a choice that would destroy part of the graph, so you could never traverse it again, or never get the opportunity to traverse it. Game designers and producers were very hesitant, and still are very hesitant, to include these because it's a high cost of content, and they don't want to cut off a piece of content purely because the players made a choice. It ramps up development costs quite significantly. So anything else I want to talk about classic trees? I think that's everything to do with the classic tree as it currently stands. The dialogue tree as it was conceived for the old Sierra games and the old LucasArts games is not that different. In fact, it's scarily similar to one you would find in the latest Dragon Age or in Mass Effect. The only thing that has advanced is the quality of the output, as in how those lines are delivered, has greatly increased. And we've done some usability improvements on how to do the inputs with, say, Mass Effect's reticle and all these systems. But ultimately, it's the same system. And as I say, it's very simple. It just evolved from a series of ifs and case statements, and then a bunch of engineers said, "Hey, we can genericize this. We can make this a system. This will reduce our costs. This will improve the stability of the project. It'll make it easier to write. It's easier to localize because we can just export all this stuff out." And all of a sudden, bam! We've got the dialogue tree, and trying to get away from that is extremely difficult and very rarely done. I mean, I can think possibly of 4 examples, maybe 4. I'm thinking Facade, Storytron, but that's a whole nother bag of fish. But yeah, so we are stuck with the dialogue tree. That's as it currently stands. I hope my rambling explanation made sense. Saying bye. Other videos to check out now are the academic realities, the crash of the AI crash and where we stand there, and the game realities. Thank you. Bye.